Well, good morning. This is a little earlier than we usually do it, but welcome to all of you. We're very excited to welcome you here to the Middle East Institute's Arab Transitions launch and to what I think and I know will be, and I hope you find some two extremely good panels. Um, my name is Wendy Chamberlain, president of the Middle East Institute, and we at the Middle East Institute are very excited about this new launch, which comes out of a lot of the transformational changes that are going on in the Arab world. Look, the shape of things to come is really not clear at this time, and perhaps won't be clear for years, maybe decades. But the process that is playing out in the Middle East will transform the Middle East as we know it today. There's no going back. And we here in Washington need to know more about the dynamics of the changes that are going on. And that's what we're about with this Arab Transitions Initiative. MEI's Arab Transition will focus our outreach and our scholarship, which has been going on for now over 60 years, on the transitions that are taking place in the region. Focusing on those countries where leadership has already changed. We'll start with Egypt, but we'll also move to Libya, Tunisia, Yemen, and hopefully Syria as well. These are all transition countries because there are new political actors, there are new dynamics, there are new opportunities, and there are new challenges. But MEI, as part of the Arab transitions, will be bringing on 3 new resident scholars. The first of our resident scholars is here with us today, Dr. al-Anani. He'll be joining us permanently in August. He's currently a professor at the University of Durham in the UK, and we're very excited to have him here. He's, I believe, one of the world's experts on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, on the Salafist movements, and on political Islam. And he'll be coming to Washington at a time when our interest in these issues are peaking. He'll be speaking later on the first panel, as you see. In addition to his writings and his analysis and that of the other scholars that we have at the Middle East Institute, we will be asking our new scholars to travel quite widely within the United States. Our ambition is to hold conferences in Chicago, LA, Houston, et cetera, out beyond the Beltway. But our ambitions don't stop there because we fully intend to make this a global program with a global reach. And in order to do that, you don't have to go to cities. You have to have a first-rate, very exciting website. So the Arab Transitions Initiatives will be spending will be investing in a new and I believe quite exciting website, innovative features at the Middle East Institute. It will, of course, include the expert nonpartisan content that our core supporters, and many of you are our core supporters, have come to expect of the Middle East Institute over the last 60 years. But we also are aiming at a younger audience, attracting a younger audience to the Middle East Institute's website. And to do this, you do it visually. You appeal to the younger audiences with interactive tools, with a lot of photos, with subtitled videos, with infographics, news feeds, and of course, Twitter. But you know, when I start talking about a visually enhanced website, it's silly to stand up and talk about it. Let me show you far better. At the top of our Arab Transitions page, we will have a rotator that features some of the more prominent and astute analysts from the region. Will be commissioning them to do analysis and informational pieces, and this will move across. Here's this picture is about, it was written by Afsaf Khalil, who tackles some of the challenges within the opposition. The content will be refreshed weekly by new work that we'll commission from writers in the region. We want to bring the voices of experts from the region to our website. Going down, I'm very excited about these interactive tools MEI is building into the site. These will be tools where the user can access, can click, and as you click down through the interactive, you can go deeper and deeper and excavate information at the user's own pace and interest. Give you a couple of examples. Will be when the site comes up, goes live in about a week, we'll have an interactive that is a continuum of the political parties in Egypt. There are over 100 of them, so this isn't an easy task, but we'll try to provide information on them. The user will be able to click onto an icon, and up will come a bubble with information on that political party along the continuum of right and left. Another interactive that we will be featuring will be the Muslim Brotherhood's statements and actions on a chronological continuum, so that you'll be able to see some of the contradictions between what is said and what is done in a totally factual way, without judgment. Below this, we have our news feed. We have commissioned with some of the more prominent English language Arab papers throughout the Middle East for daily articles on our website. We'll also have almost a Agence Française Presse, so minute-to-minute news articles will also appear. You don't have to leave our site to get your news. Below that, our Twitter feed. Middle East Institute now has 13,000 followers. I noticed that Khalil has 22,000, but we're increasing fast, and and we're going to catch up to you. But this is a way of really expanding your information and also providing very current information on your site, even more current than the newsfeed. Going down further, you can see one of our infographics. It's a slider that shows you upcoming events. You now know where to come if ever you want to know when Ramadan starts. We'll have it on our slider. And some of the more fun stuff, the videos. Everybody loves videos. And we are aware that the Middle East Institute has an iconic Arabic language program. But one of the absences, one of the great needs that Arabic language students have is a tool where they can listen in Arabic and read the subtitles and study on their own. We will have this now on our website. The first video, and we'll show a little bit of it to you, is a really fun one, even if you're not an Arabic language student. It's Bassem Youssef's, who's the Egyptian Jon Stewart, and our first clip will show a little bit of his roasting the president. Perhaps you want to.
احنا لاحظنا شوية حاجات في الخطاب حبينا ان احنا نشارككم فيها. اولا، ماذا سيفعل بنا الرئيس؟
سأضطر لأكثر من ذلك. سأضطر لفعل أكثر من ذلك. أنني إذا اضطررت سأفعل. وها أنا أفعل.
لا يا ريس، مثل ذلك وإلى ذلك وأكثر من ذلك. هو بعد ذلك ثانية واحدة. انتوا لاحظتوا حاجة مهمة في الخطاب ده؟ الرئيس قال لنا هيعمل إيه فينا بالتفصيل.
أنني إذا اضطررت سأفعل. وها أنا أفعل.
Do you see Jon Stewart right down to the expletives? Photos are fun, and we have a special feature here, a photo gallery. Our first one will show examples of some of the political graffiti in Egypt. You know, with the crackdown on free media and free press in Egypt, public spaces with graffiti has become an important way of expressing political views. Even even throughout the Middle East, graffiti is a new contemporary art form. Well, this photo gallery that we'll have first is shows you some of the graffiti that you can find out there in Cairo today. I just love these photos. Finally, there's a lot to explore, but for those of you who don't sit in front of your computer, but get your information, go to websites on your telephone when you're in the taxi cab or wherever you are, we will have the website specially configured for iPhones and Android phones. It's called mobile optimization, and that we're building that into the website as well. So I'll stop here. We've got a terrific panel that we'll move to. We're very excited about this website. We're still polishing it. It will go live in about a week, so start to look for it. Now, I'm going to turn the podium over to our scholar, Mohammed Al-Manshawi, who will be moderating the panel and introducing the speakers. Welcome and enjoy the morning.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming in this rainy day. I'm proud to moderating the first panel discussion with the new project in MEI. Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Kate, for that. And the title of the panel today is, or the first one is, Egypt in Crisis. It's obvious for everybody, especially those who live in Egypt, which reached 90 million few weeks ago, to live in daily crisis. The crisis has many faces. It's obvious and has many faces. One face is the Egyptian pound. Egyptian pound lost 25% of its value in last 2 years. Of this, 15% just lost in last 3 months. And Egypt's foreign reserve is barely covering the imports of Egyptian imports for only 3 months. And that's very red zone and scary number for Egyptian economy. Going to Egypt, you will notice long lines for bread, for car gas, for cooking gas. It's obvious, and you don't need to be a local Egyptian to understand that or notice that. Aside from that, power cut is routine in Egypt, especially in summers. Egyptian media preparing citizens of Egypt for severe cut and shortage of power in the next few months. So the crisis is there in that level. Besides that, crime rate is tripled from 2 years ago. Egypt was very safe society for female, for tourists, for Egyptians to walk after midnight. Now it's very scary to walk even in your neighborhood in the evening. It's very sad news for most Egyptians who usually believe their city doesn't sleep, so they are very much awake in the night time. And Sinai is a very critical area, and it's lawless. Yesterday incident proved my case. It's very scary. It's time bomb, and no serious measures are taken by the current government and the previous government as well. And aside from that, we have a polarized political process, which is most important, and the solution or the starting point to solve this crisis is a political process which very much polarized. Governor of Egypt, the president of Egypt and his group doesn't talk to the opposition, and this stalemate, it doesn't take the country to any good direction in the next few months, though we have election in 5-6 months from today. Portraying this scary crisis, who is responsible? Is it the Muslim Brotherhood and President Morsi government, the way they deal with Egypt since they took power in 8 months? Or the non-Islamist in power, meaning Salafists and other political Islamist players who are dominating the parliament? Or the liberal secular opposition who just in the other end of what Brotherhood produce and introduce and believe in? Or as some Egyptians believe or love to believe, it's America. We are fortunate today to have 4 experts. They could talk about this crisis in more details and about these players and who to be responsible. We have, as Wendy introduced, Dr. al-Anani, who will be joining MEI in mid-August. He's currently a professor and analyst in University of Durham in United Kingdom. He writes bi-monthly column for pan-Arab newspaper Al-Hayah, based in London, and writes for Egyptian Al-Ahram Weekly every 2 weeks as well, distinguished newspaper in Egypt in English. And he is well-known analyst in Islamic movement, not only in Egypt, but globally. And he is a familiar face in major network news, CNN, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and a lot of Egyptian networks. Dr. Nathan Brown will speak after that, and he's professor of politics in George Washington University here in Washington. We should congratulate him. He just named the Guggenheim Scholar for 2013 a few days ago, and he is one of the authority in the city about rule of law and institutionalization of the Arab politics. Michael Hanna will speak after, and his senior fellow is at the Century Foundation in New York City. He works in issue of international security, international law, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and South Asia. He is a lawyer by training. He spent 1 year as Fulbright scholar in Egypt. He speaks fluent Arabic. And he is a term member as a Council for Foreign Relations in New York City as well. Finally will be Dr. Samer Shehata, professor of Georgetown School of Arab, Center for Contemporary Arabic Studies. He's specialized in Islamic movement, Muslim Brotherhood. He is a renowned writer. He has several books about the Muslim Brotherhood, and he received his PhD from Princeton University in New Jersey. And with that, I will ask Dr. al-Anani to open the discussion.
Thank you, Mohammed. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I'd like to thank Kate and Wendy for inviting me to take part in this conference. And I'm really glad to join the MEI. I'm looking forward to working with both of you. I'm going to talk about the role of the Muslim Brotherhood and the current crisis. But before I do that, I'd like to just highlight 3 general and broad points here. The first one is about how can we perceive what's happening now in Egypt? How can we understand it? How can we portray it? Is it an abnormal crisis? Or is it a stage in a long and complex and to some extent nasty transition process? And I would say for myself at least, I don't look at this as an abnormal crisis. I think it's a very natural outcome of this complicated situation that started immediately after the revolution, particularly under SCAF or under the military, when they produced a very flawed and very complex process for the transition, which led to many consequences that we're still suffering from it until now. So I don't want to exaggerate or overestimate what's happening now in Egypt. At the same time, I don't want to underestimate it. It's a crisis, absolutely. But put it in this kind of a broad context. This crisis is not something unusual. It happened all over the world. These countries that witnessed some kind of transition over the last 3 decades, they encountered similar, even if not worse than this. That's what's happening now in Egypt. We can talk about what happened in Argentina, what happened in Portugal, what happened in Spain, what happened in Greece, what happened in Poland, Eastern Europe. So this is something, I would say, to some extent natural to have this kind of uncertainty about the future. There is no clear rules for the game. There is absence of these rules. There is lack of consensus between different political parties or forces. There is structural problems in Egypt that is inherited from the last era, particularly under Mubarak. So we need to hang on and just rethink about many assumptions about this kind of transition, particularly that some people think that each transition should lead at the end to democracy, which is I think it's a very misleading assumption. If you look at transitions that happen in the world, and I've come across a recent study that studied these transitions over the last half century, since 1955 until 2007, and it counted at least 155 cases. And I found very interesting findings from this study that at least 43% of these transitions regressed back to some kind of autocracy and authoritarianism. So moving from autocracy doesn't mean that you are moving towards democracy. So just we need to, to be calm and to rethink these big issues. This is the first point. The second point about our expectations from the Muslim Brotherhood. And I found this is, to some extent, a very confusing issue. because some people tend to put the Brotherhood whether on this side that it's a very authoritarian movement, doesn't have any kind of democracy or any kind of transparency. And there's a tendency that some others might think that this is a democratic movement and it can lead to some kind of functioning democracy in Egypt. And I think we need to rethink the underlying fact behind this, statement, which means that the connection between inclusion and moderation. And this is a very known hypothesis within this literature about Islamist movements, to what extent when you include these kind of ideological movements that they can adapt and change their behavior and their ideology to become more moderate and more transparent. And I would say, instead of focusing on what's happening in Egypt, we need to focus on what's happening within the Brotherhood. I think the movement itself under immense pressure, and it is in some kind of a transition itself. There is many dynamics that's happening now within the movement that I'm going to explain more when I talk about their role in the current crisis. The last point is about, it will be misleading if we hang the responsibility about what's happening now in Egypt only on the Brotherhood. I think the other parties or the other forces, they have their own share of the responsibility, particularly, as I said before, the military and the army, when they took power and they didn't push the country in a good way that can have a clear plan for the future. So each party, each force has its own share of this crisis. Of course, the lion's share is for the Brotherhood because now they are the ruling force now in Egypt. But we should not also overlook the responsibility of other forces. Then I will move now to look at how can we make sense of the Brotherhood regime or Brotherhood rule now in Egypt? How can we explain this kind of odd and to some extent vexing and puzzling behavior? Why they act in such bad way? Why they tend to reproduce the same policies of Mubarak again? So I think there are three main factors or three main reasons behind this kind of confusing behavior of the Muslim Brotherhood. The first one has something to do with the ideological paradox of the Brotherhood. And this paradox comes from the multidimensional character of the Brotherhood. As we all know that we are not talking only about a political party. We are talking about something like socio-religious political movement that encompasses different aspects. And this kind of formula used to work in the past, before the revolution, that they could survive by this kind of comprehensive kind of ideology. But I think now they are encountering the problem of that, how can they separate between these dimensions? And I think this is one of the reasons behind their confusing behavior now. So they don't know whether they should remain as a preaching movement, da'wah, or religious movement that can disseminate what they think the Islamic knowledge or the Islamic values and morals, or they should move to be a political party. They also don't know whether they should act as a responsible ruling force or to continue to play the role of the opposition. And I think they still in this kind of grappling between shifting the direction, shifting the mindset. Now they are calling tomorrow for a demonstration against the judiciary in Egypt now, which they still also, I mean, they are in power, but they're still acting as an opposition movement, which is something really surprising. Also, they still thinking that they can, act as a charity organization, which means that they used to get money from here to put it there and, try to, behave in a very different way from behaving as policy-making people. So now they don't have this mentality of planning and drawing and making policy. And the implications of this paradox, ideological paradox, is that you can find some kind of confusion on objectives. They don't know what exactly they want. Second, this kind of difficulty to adapt with the new environment. Third, that they have miscalculations. And I would say one of the major miscalculations that they did, that they decided to participate in the last presidential elections to take power. And I think it was a very contested issue within the Brotherhood. If we remember, last April, when they hold this kind of internal elections and vote over should they field somebody to the elections or not? And we found that it was 52% against 48%. 52 they were with participating, and 48 was. So this means that they didn't have the plan to continue to take power. Yes, they were happy with this kind of taking over the parliament and then forming the government. But also we need to look at the background why they decided to move forward and to run in the election. So in this kind of uncertainty, we should expect some kind of mistakes and miscalculation. This is, I would say, this is a very natural thing that happens within the transition process. The second point, the second reason that might explain, and I'm not justifying, and there's a big difference between justifying what they are doing and between attempting to understand why they act in such a way. So I'm trying to just unpack this black box of the Brotherhood. The second reason has something to do with the organizational mindset. We are talking about secretive organization that used to operate underground over the last, I would say, 3 or even 6 decades, since 1954. And this pattern of secretive organization led to different mindset, led to different norms and values, which is still affecting the organization until now. What's happening now that they brought all the ills and the problems of the organization to the public sphere. And instead of trying to change to the public sphere and to adapt to the state, they try to adapt the state to their organizational norms and values, which something can explain why they tend to capture and to take over different institutions. They still thinking within this kind of organizational mindset and organizational box. Second point within this point is that to understand why the Brotherhood treat and deal with the opposition in such exclusive way, we need to understand how they deal with the internal opposition. And they, unfortunately, adopt the same norm that they used to use to deal with the internal opposition. In other words, if you have some sort of reformist voices within the Brotherhood, and they adopt different views, and they might disagree with the leadership, the mechanism that is used to deal with this is excluding, marginalizing, or freezing this kind of voices, right? Exactly, they do the same thing with the opposition. And they are affected by this kind of conspiracy thinking, that everyone is not with us, is against us. And this has something to do with this kind of socialization process, indoctrination process that happens, and this is a very complex process that I don't think that I have time to explain more. So I used to say that the revolution came on the wrong time of the Brotherhood. Over the last, I have to run, okay. Over the last, I would say, decade, the Brotherhood was dominated by what I'm calling as the conservative wing within the movement. And we are talking about a very specific, I'm calling narrow power center within the movement, which is based on the old guards, particularly Mahmoud Izzat, Khairat al-Shatir, Mohammed Badi' to some extent. And they took over the movement over the last 10 years. And they restructured the movement to serve their own interests. And these guys, they adopt very conservative ideology in terms of political views and in terms of religious and social views. So the movement now is under the domination and control of these guys. The question is to what extent these guys can change their views. This is something we need to wait to see. The implications of this kind of organizational mindset and this balance of power within the movement, which is not in favor of the reformists, if we assume that there is reformists within the Brotherhood, is that you have a flawed decision-making process that doesn't have any kind of real democracy in taking decisions or real negotiation. They are not able to give concessions to the opposition because they have their own mindset. They don't have the ability to build some kind of cross-ideological alliances. And they think by the idea of domination instead of participation. And this is they used to say that musharaka la mughalaba. Now they take over everything and they left everything outside. The last point, which is very important here, just to understand why they are behaving in such way, we should look at the impact of repression on the Brotherhood over the last 3 decades. And I think at a glance, I can look at the Brotherhood as a victim of Mubarak era, to be frank with you. These guys were barred, excluded from any access to public institutions over the last 3 decades. If you are a Brotherhood member, you didn't have the right to move above certain kind of lines within the state institutions, unlike what happened in Turkey with the AK party when they included gradually within the political process over the last 2 decades, and they moved, and they had to adapt with this kind of environment, and this was not the case in Egypt. And this might push us to think about the differences between the sudden inclusion that happens with the Brotherhood after the revolution and the gradual one that can push them to change their mindset. And I'm also thinking about if we have in Egypt someone like Monsef Marzouki, the Tunisian president, that he can play the role of this kind of mediator between different political forces. So the thing is, I mean, just imagine yourself acting for three decades under this kind of oppression and repressive environment. And suddenly you move to a very political environment. I think they cannot so far make this kind of shift between behaving under repression and behaving in this kind of political openness. And this can explain to some extent why they are not keen to change. In other words, these guys used to ride a bike for 3 decades. Suddenly, they have to ride a car without a license. So just imagine what they will do. And practically, they don't have a legal license to be a legal movement. Let me finish by giving this in conclusions that I was trying to say that any assessment for a Brotherhood need to take into account different factors. One of them is the legacy of the last regime. Second point is the mindset of the Brotherhood that was shaped over the last 3 decades. And the last thing, the responsibility of other parties that might share this kind of a crisis. And I will end with this and wait for the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me begin just by thanking MEI and also by welcoming Khalil back to town. He was here some years ago. I first met him here in Washington, and it's going to be great to have you back contributing to our discussions, not simply by writing, but also in person. Khalil, you began by telling us just to remain calm, and that's probably good advice because, to be honest, I wouldn't say that I'm not calm, but I am a little bit down about Egyptian politics, and I'm not alone. I look at the title of this, and it's Egypt in Crisis, and I look at the title of this panel, and it's Egypt's Growing Political Crisis, and I'm thinking, this doesn't really sound all that good. It reminds me of something I said before, that if you were a lazy journalist, there is no such thing, but if there were such a thing as a lazy journalist and they wanted to write a story of the Middle East basically any time over the last 4 decades or so, they could just title it Lebanese Political Crisis Continues, okay? And then everybody, the details are going to be too complicated for anybody to understand, so they won't read the story. And my question is, are we getting to the same part in Egypt, the same place in Egypt? Egyptian political crisis continues. It's too complicated to understand the players and what they're doing and so forth and so on. And my answer is, I think, yes, we're there at least for another year or so. And I don't know. Khalil zoomed out to give us a big cross-national picture. I can't quite see that far, but I can see probably for about the next year or so. I will try to give sort of an optimistic scenario about how things could go better, but I'm not sure it's going to work out that way. What I want to focus on is essentially the constitutional process, because that was something that, in a sense, I mean, the Egyptian Revolution was about many things, but one of the things it was about was fundamentally reconstructing the political system through really what was, in a sense, a very optimistic view of politics. That if we can get the basic rules of the political game right, then we can basically reform our political institutions, reform our society, build a more prosperous society, solve all of our problems, and so forth and so on. And so this was an intimate part, and it is still the case that many of the elements of Egypt's incredibly complicated political crisis are fundamentally constitutional in nature. Who's got authority to do what? What are the basic rules of the political game, written or unwritten? And so let me just start by sort of focusing on that. And there is, here I will be sort of broad and cross-national like Khalil started. There is some sort of growing received wisdom about constitution writing in transition societies. And one of the points that I think sort of the academic and the practitioner literature would agree on is that process is as important as product, that constitution writing done properly can be a way of essentially bringing various political forces together to come to a consensus about the basic rules of the political game, and that if you do that right, you're off to a good start for normal politics, and if you do that wrong, it's going to be hard to correct that later on. I don't want to push that too far. Let me say a couple words about the Egyptian constitution, its text and its substance, but then I want to say something about process. In terms of text, it is always the case, and I'm not going to go through, don't worry, I'm not going to go through particular clauses. There's all kinds of things that I would love to talk about, and all sorts of potential pitfalls and some positive elements as well. But anytime you have a constitution that's written in an intensely political process, that's a product of sort of a crisis and uncertain environment, certain things get into the constitutional text that 1 year later you're wondering, why was that there? And it's there because so-and-so threatened to walk out if they didn't get this language, so they got, but so-and-so didn't want that language, so they found a word that kind of meant the same thing, and this sort of thing. And therefore, anytime you write a constitution like that, there are going to be elements like that. And when you write a constitutional process, when you write a constitution, the final draft of the constitution, as Egyptians did, in literally an all-nighter, you can remember back to your student days, if you ever did such a thing, what the paper looked like the next day when you woke up and actually read what you had written. So this document is going to be full of all kinds of surprises and time bombs that I think, if the Constitution survives, and my guess is the text will survive, perhaps modified, perhaps not, Egyptians are going to come up with all kinds of surprises of things that they didn't realize that they had done over the next few years, and it's already beginning to happen, in fact. But let me talk a little bit about a process as well, because in a sense, part of the reason for Egypt's current political crisis, or the worsening, the growing political crisis, is that this process didn't do what it was supposed to do. Like Khalil, I agree that there's lots of blame to go around. Virtually every single political actor acted in a way that made this worse. I, like him, also blame or think that a lot of these decisions, even if they were ones that didn't serve Egypt well, were understandable at the time. Perhaps because I'm a charitable guy, I basically blame a lot of the errors on some basic fundamentally understandable but bad decisions that were made going back to February and March of 2011 that set up a process that was almost designed. I mean, I use the term time bomb to refer to the text. I think there were time bombs in the process itself which went off one after another. But the result is unmistakable, and that is, if we were to talk about the crisis or the problems in Egypt's political life today, I think we'd focus on two. One which is apparent, very, very apparent. One which is a little bit less apparent, but I think equally pressing. The one that is extremely apparent is just the extreme polarization and the fact that you've got political forces who, when they talk to each other, you said they don't talk to each other. No, they don't. They shout at each other, and they shout at each other very, very shrilly, and they talk to themselves and get themselves worked up and there's no place where they're actually talking together in order to solve problems or to engage in a common project or even to come to a compromise. And the constitutional process unmistakably aggravated that tremendously. You have a document right now that is a fundamental law of Egypt, which is regarded as illegitimate by important political forces in the country, and in fact is held with even some disdain by members of the judiciary who are in some some ways responsible for interpreting and enforcing it. So if you go into politics with that polarization having been worsened by the constitution process, something went wrong. The other political problem, which I think gets a little bit less attention, but I think is equally severe, is the fact that basically Egypt's state institutions, Egypt's basic institutions, most of them function. They function clunkily, they function badly, but they continue to function, but they function unreformed. And the promise of the Egyptian Revolution of January and February 2011 was comprehensive reform of all the society's institutions, especially the political institutions, and that simply hasn't happened. Essentially, you got, if anything, some of these institutions, the military and the security apparatus, not simply unreformed, but operating without the kind of oversight they at least had when they had an authoritarian president who was able to control them and to call them to account. Now they don't even have that. So what you have is essentially partly because of the constitutional crisis. Let me put it this way. Those two problems, I think, are very much related. The fact that you have this extreme polarization and that you have this blocked political reform process are very much of a piece. And the reason that I say that is that what you have right now is an elected president, and an elected president who looks out from what we can tell at the political scene and looks at the opposition and says they're a lost cause. First, they don't represent anybody. Their primary constituency is on talk shows. So I don't really have to come to terms with them. And even if I tried, they're unreasonable people and I would fail. However, when I look at the possible political challenges, I see some a little bit closer to me, and that's basically military security apparatus, and I know how to come to terms with them. And so in a sense, what you have is a situation in which, rather than having a political process oversee the reform of state institutions, you have a political process that freezes them in place. The one possible exception, and Khalil mentioned this, is the judiciary. And so you have, I will simply say, the puzzling prospect tomorrow of a million-man march or million-person demonstration calling for independence of the judiciary by purging it, which is, again, just an odd way to go about the process of judicial reform, is to make anybody over 60 retired immediately. It's not what most people have in mind when they talk about judicial reform. Why is it so sort of evolving in such a problematic way? Again, because there isn't the kind of broad political consensus that is necessary in order to move forward, so that any step that the presidency takes, or that the Brotherhood or the Freedom and Justice Party takes towards institutional reform, is seen immediately by the opposition as brotherhoodization of brotherhoodization of the state, and so they don't really have the political base to do so. And when they do it in a way that looks partisan and often is partisan, so that you have that political reform process blocked. Now, I said at the beginning that I would try to give you some sort of optimistic scenario, and I can spin one out very, very easily. I'm just not sure it's going to happen. And the optimistic scenario would go something like this. It would say, forget this thing about process being more important than product. The world is full of constitutions that were badly written, illegitimately written, and that work, okay? The Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Constitution of Japan, both written under foreign occupation by people who basically held their noses as they wrote these documents. Egypt's own political history has a 1923 constitution that was rejected by the country's largest political party at the time, the WAFT, and yet within a couple of years the WAFT was screaming for reinstituting this constitution and for following its rules. So sometimes politics these frameworks take on a life of their own as those people who were suspicious of or opposed to it decide, for whatever reason, this is inevitable, or wait a second, it gave us some tools which we didn't realize we had. The French left suddenly discovered that a strong presidency was a very good thing after they won a presidential election. So is something like that possible? I don't know if it's possible. It's not off to a very good start. I would give you two things to look for to see whether or not this Egyptian political crisis continues is going to be a headline for the next year or for the next 10 years. First is elections. And to me, the most important thing is who participates and what kind of result do you have? Do you have a viable opposition in the parliament that runs and runs hard and that begins to think when we enter normal political process and the electoral political process, there is some promise for us? No, we don't like that constitution, but it gives us tools that we can use to reform the political system and achieve our ends. That's the obvious one. The less obvious one, and the one that'll take an awful lot more work, so I'm grateful to MEI to bring another expert to town to help us figure this out, is reading the fine print of legislation. I refer to the judicial law. There's all kinds of laws and projects out there on Al-Azhar, civil service, and so forth and so on, and how those are written. The details of how those are written is going to determine how Egyptian political and state institutions function and whether they basically serve the interests of the entire society or become narrow partisan battlegrounds for whoever happens to be in power at the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Nathan described himself as a charitable guy, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. In fact, for the past year and a half, whenever the two of us have been involved in public discussions on Egypt, he's always offered the optimistic take, and I've inevitably given the sort of pessimistic take. So now that Nathan is beginning to verge into the pessimism, we should all be a little bit really nervous that things are getting serious. I'm going to chat with you all about U.S. policy on Egypt, and it's something that has been a big focus of mine of late, more so than perhaps internal Egyptian political dynamics, and I've been increasingly critical. I come at this from an angle that assumes that Egyptian citizens are going to be the primary drivers of change and the political trajectory of the transition. It is not a place of hubris that assumes the United States can dictate outcomes. That's never been the case in the Middle East, ever. Arab politics has existed as its own sphere, and the United States had a say in terms of trying to influence events, but never a role where it was able to dictate. And it's not going to happen now. So it's a more humble perspective that thinks that the United States should be trying to encourage positive trends as opposed to increasing moral hazard and I think pushing politics in a more negative direction. And I think, unfortunately, that we have somehow found ourselves now in something like that. I don't think it is an intentional policy for the most part, but I do think there has been a great deal of drift and, frankly, continuity with many of the assumptions that undergirded U.S.-Egypt relations for many years. It looks like we are assuming some of the strange dysfunctions of client-state relationships and the moral hazard that that undergirds that. And I think that's a strange place to be at this point. Past policy toward Egypt was flawed, clearly, particularly with respect to the Muslim Brotherhood. We wanted to assume reality away, and our engagement with the Brotherhood was very limited. It was cramped. We went along with the imaginary framework of the Mubarak regime, and so U.S. diplomats only engaged with the independents in parliament, and it's affected our ability to engage more broadly and coherently since the fall of Mubarak. This lack of depth has meant that in some ways we have overcompensated. And this has sent its own signals out toward Egyptian society, and it's been interpreted in many ways. I think we've been very clumsy in dealing with the division that Khalil talked about between the Muslim Brotherhood, the social organization, the secret organization, the one that is not licensed, that is not transparent, and the FJP, the Freedom and Justice Party, which is the political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. In a normal political setting, I think the United States would have no trouble in engaging with both political actors and important social actors. But in this context in Egypt now, when there is a great deal of incoherence about the fundamental relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood, something that is viewed with suspicion by many quarters of Egyptian society. It is a secret society. It does lack transparency. We don't know where the Muslim Brotherhood gets its money. These are real questions. There are real questions as to how the policy process works. When Mohammed Morsi says he's going to give a speech and then 8 hours of delay commence, the assumption of many Egyptians is that the president now has to send a speech to be vetted by the senior leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, and that's probably true, frankly. So this is not an independent actor. He is someone who is a party man. He is someone steeped in the organization and its mechanics. And so just that one misstep alone, I think, reinforces suspicion. Now, some suspicion has become outlandish. In Egypt now, there are assumptions about U.S. Muslim Brotherhood plots, favoritism for a sort of Sunni crescent that is the new U.S. strategy. And of course, the Egyptian press has played this up in many ways as a way to undermine the Muslim Brotherhood. And so there's clearly this broader conspiracy that is going to exist regardless. But of course, in all of this, there is a slight, tiny grain of truth, and I think the way we've approached the Brotherhood has been problematic. I think it also represents a lot of assumptions about what these elections mean and what this moment means for Egypt. I happen to think that this set of elections that has taken place are more the function of the Mubarak era, as Khalid mentioned, and I think they are sort of the last elections, if you will, of that era. They represent the status quo that emerged immediately after the fall of Mubarak. I don't think Egyptian politics are going to look the same in 5 years. I don't think necessarily that we can make assumptions about political dominance of the Muslim Brotherhood 5, 10 years into the future. We've seen that voter allegiance and political affiliation is very dynamic and fragile and fluid and in some ways incoherent. If you talk to voters about their preferences in the first round of the presidential election and the second, you often got answers that didn't make sense. And so this is a time of real dynamism in Egyptian politics. You have political party life for the first time. Ahmed Shafi almost won the presidency. This was supposedly at the time of his resignation, the discredited former prime minister, last prime minister of Mubarak. And yet, he almost won the presidency. And so we shouldn't make too many assumptions about where the Brotherhood is going to be in politics. They're clearly the most coherent, the most popular. They will be the leading party, I think, in any new parliament when those elections happen, most likely in the fall. But that doesn't mean they have a sort of lock on continued control over the Egyptian state. And so how we approach them matters. In many ways, some of those early engagements reflected a sense that this was the new power in town, something like the new NDP. And this is where you went to get things done and to have decisions made. And so I think it's part and parcel of, I think, a very clumsy engagement that comes out of some of the past sins of our policy towards them. I also think we have taken a strange approach to the opposition. And this isn't just U.S. diplomats, European diplomats. In many of my discussions with them, there is a rightful frustration with the opposition. Khalil touched on this as well. The blame goes all around. But some of the frustrations with the opposition's fragmentation, their dysfunction, has been transferred from rightful frustration with them to, in essence, further support for the Brotherhood as the one coherent political bloc that you have to deal with. These are the guys that can get things done. Again, these are two distinct issues. Whether clearly a healthy and a viable opposition will produce a much more balanced and healthy political life. We see how that looks in terms of Tunisia, right? The transition process has to reflect consideration of a broader set of interests, and it produces different outcomes. So this is clearly a concern, but frustrations with the opposition shouldn't affect our judgments about 2 minutes, Ed. All right. It shouldn't affect our judgments about what the Muslim Brotherhood is undertaking. The clearest microcosm of that, I think, comes in the constitutional declaration crisis of November 22nd. And part of it stems from some of the old assumptions about U.S.-Egypt relations that primarily see Egypt through the Camp David lens. This has always been the approach that prioritizes regional security and has given Egyptian rulers, and we saw this very clearly in the Mubarak era, wide swaths to deal with their country as they saw fit and as repressive as they wanted to be. And in that Gaza crisis and the following ceasefire, we saw a glimpse of that, where the timing is not unlinked. Immediately after being showered with praise for his role in brokering the Gaza ceasefire, Morsi comes out it's very problematic timing in terms of the optics for the United States. And I don't think there was any type of communication beforehand. But the appearance looked quite bad, that immediately after his role in the Gaza ceasefire, that Morsi comes out with an autocratic constitutional declaration, one that in the manner in which it pushed through the Constitution, institutionalized political crisis into the sort of fundamental hardwiring of the state. And our response was muted. It was one of equivalence. And this was a point when we needed to be more forthright, to speak more bluntly. There have been multiple crises along the way, and the United States can't be embroiled in the minutia of Egyptian politics. The international community can't be involved at that level. But this was a fundamental crisis. We missed our spot in terms of trying to call attention to this very important issue that I think it makes the ability to gather a political consensus much more difficult, because it is not a function of legislation. We're talking about a constitution. It is hardwired into the state. That one, I think, microcosm is troubling. And one of the other assumptions that underlines it, I think, and it's often unstated, is the past authoritarian bargain, which assumed the possibility of repressive stability. And I'll end on this. I don't think this is an issue of values versus interest, which has often dominated U.S. foreign policy discussions. I don't think that bargain is available anymore. If you take a course that is repressive, and we've seen hints of this in many ways, whether it be crackdowns on protest, continued police violence and torture, crackdowns on expression and the media, these actions are now fundamentally destabilizing. If we believe that somehow we are going to reach a new political equilibrium that looks something like past repressive stability, I don't think that exists in Egypt anymore. I think it ignores the fundamentally transformed nature of Egyptian society and Egyptian political life, and the dynamics of mass mobilization, and more troubling, the introduction of political violence by both sides into the equation. So I think we have to reinterrogate our basic assumptions about this relationship, and we should pick our spots. Again, we aren't going to, the United States and the international community cannot dictate outcomes to Egypt, but how we approach Egypt, how we deal with the IMF loan. If we want to push the IMF to grant a deal, a sweetheart deal to the Egyptians that pushes off conditionality till after the elections, that is a further sign of the moral hazard at play. And I think we cannot be so defensive in terms of how we approach Egypt, because I think if we are going to, I think, push forward more negative outcomes. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Hannah.
Great, thanks. I'd like to also thank MEI for inviting me and also congratulate them on this wonderful new initiative, and to welcome Khalil again back into town. I think I found things to agree with, but also to disagree with, from the three previous speakers. So I think I definitely fall into the category of the sky is not falling, that there is certainly a crisis, and this is to echo what Khalil mentioned earlier, and there tends to be, in fact, a discourse in Egypt, sometimes in the United States, that Egypt is going to become a failed state somehow, or that there are going to be deep social unrest that sends the country into a crisis that it can't return from. And I'm certainly not of that opinion. I also agree with Nathan that with regard, and this is a very sad reality, that with regard to the Constitution, process is important as product, and certainly the process involved in writing the Egyptian Constitution was farcical, if the document itself isn't farcical. And I agree with Michael that this is certainly a dynamic political situation, and I think it would be foolhardy to imagine or to think or to believe that 5 years from now, a Muslim Brotherhood member is going to be president, that 10 years from now, a Muslim Brotherhood leader is going to be president, and they're going to dominate the political scene. We've already seen very kind of real indicators of declining support for the Freedom and Justice Party, for Mr. Morsi, in a number of different elections, at the student level and also in professional syndicates, in addition to polling. So I think that the situation is certainly dynamic. I think if we want to go even further, and again, this is to echo something that I think is very important and sometimes isn't very popular, and that is to get a sense of how the different actors see the world. And I am moving from my script here because I was mandated to speak about the opposition, which I will in a moment. But I think if we want to understand what is going on, the decision-making that is taking place among the different actors, they have quite different views of the situation. And this is in no way to justify the actions of Mr. Morsi, but from the perspective of Mr. Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, there has not been, or at least there wasn't, when February 12th came around, a revolution that took place in Egypt. That the Mubarak regime was still in place, that the military and the security forces who were very much opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood were still there, that the judiciary and the Supreme Constitutional Court, members appointed by Mubarak, hostile to the Muslim Brotherhood, were still there and trying to do devious things to upend the transition to a democratic political system, that there were many elements in society that not only despise the Muslim Brotherhood, but don't accept them as a legitimate political player. There has also been, over the last months and so on, unfortunate violence against protesters and the continuation of torture and so on. But there's also been, this is again from the perspective of the Muslim Brotherhood, this is not my perspective, violence against the Muslim Brotherhood. There has been, I think, over 50 Muslim Brotherhood offices that have been torched across the country. There have been open calls for a coup against Mr. Morsi, a petition that is being signed by people asking the Minister of the Defense to intervene. And so it calls for early elections, that is for Mr. Morsi not to continue for 4 years. And this is the perspective, this is the view that I think many people in the Muslim Brotherhood hold, and this, of course, can explain to some extent their actions that seem to be conspiracy centered and so on, in addition to the fact that when they look at members of the National Salvation Front and the opposition, what they see from their perspective, again, not mine, are sour grapes and sore losers. People who got less than 20% in the 2011 parliamentary elections, a student who got a C- on a paper and wants an A- grade. And that, of course, I think affects their approach to dealing with the situation. Okay. I don't want to reiterate, I think, the very important points that have been made with regard to some foundational issues. I mean, Obviously, a struggle for power is taking place in Egypt among different political actors, not just the Muslim Brotherhood and the opposition, but the military, the interior ministry, and others and so on. And the struggle is both a struggle for power, but it's also a struggle about the identity of post-Mubarak Egypt, and a struggle about the relationship between religion and state, which has significant consequences for issues such as citizenship, gender rights, freedoms, and so on. And the struggle is taking place without basic agreement about the rules of the political game, and between actors that have little faith in one another and in some cases despise one another, and as I mentioned a moment ago, actors that view the world very, very differently. Okay, so in the remaining minutes that I have, and you'll tell me, Mohammed, how many minutes I have left, I want to do what I was supposed to do, which is talk about the liberal, quote-unquote, liberal secular opposition. Well, clearly there was a liberal secular opposition before Mohamed Morsi's November 22nd constitutional declaration, but I think what we're interested in is the National Salvation Front that is composed of a number of those secular liberal forces, but other ones. Certainly Mr. Baradei's Constitution Party, the Free Egyptians Party, Sabahi's now popular Current that partially was the Karama Party, the Weft Party, the Social Democrats, Amr Musa, and an alliance of other ones. I think there's no question, if one looks at the history between February 11th, 2011 until today, that the period between Morsi's constitutional declaration on November 22nd until presently really represents a kind of critical turning point. This is the period of the most intense crisis, as it were, that consolidated the view and the suspicions that many people, and again, this is now the perspective of the secular opposition, had of the Muslim Brotherhood as an authoritarian political organization, as an organization that made commitments to political inclusion. Remember, Mr. Morsi met with many of these individuals and the people they represent before the second round of the elections when he was facing Ahmed Shafiq and made promises to them, which he has broken, about inclusion, about appointing a woman as a vice president, about appointing a Christian as a vice president, and all kinds of other things. And they see the infiltration of the Muslim Brotherhood into the state, Ikhwanat al-Dawla, their attempt to take over the state. They see failure to be inclusive. They see incompetence in management, administrative incompetence, and Muslim Brotherhood members who are advising the president are holding positions of power that lack professionalism, that by their own admission were unprepared to govern and are overwhelmed by the situation that they face and so on. And that is their own charitable admission. They see, and I see, the continued use of excessive force against civilian protesters, now not to defend the Mubarak regime, but from the perspective of many people to defend Mr. Morsi and so on, and the government. They see also intimidation and harassment through laws, through statements against public figures, against journalists. They see a constitution that is illegitimate and a president who has lost legitimacy, and very serious concerns about the illiberal direction that Egypt is taking. And of course, that is what motivated the calls for a boycott early on when the elections were scheduled for mid to late April, but of course now they have been postponed. I, again, do not see the sky as falling. I see this being a very significant crisis, but I don't think we are going to end up either as a Somalia or as a Lebanon 1975, 1976. And there are reasons for that. And some of the reasons have to do with the makeup of the liberal secular opposition, and some of the reasons have to do with Egypt's importance in the region and what benefits accrue as a result of that. I don't think, and we're seeing more and more talk of participation in the elections, I don't think we're going to see a boycott of the elections. There's talk now about, and there was talk before, about negotiation between the Morsi government and some of the secular opposition parties. Their demands for participation have been reduced significantly from the 14 original demands that the National Salvation Front made to about 3 demands now that Mr. al-Baradei al-Baradei has put forward most recently. It's quite likely, and we've already seen indications of this, that there will be some fragmentation and that some groups will want to participate in the elections. Boycotts are very, very difficult things to undertake because they are collective action problems in reverse. And there are increased incentives for individuals or parties to participate knowing that they're going to benefit from the non-participation of others. I think I'd be willing to bet anybody in this room $1,000 that the WEF will participate in the elections and so on because they have benefited from participation in the past. They have a network outside of Cairo. They're going to get some seats. I think we're going to see some participation from other political players as well. And that's a good thing for the reasons that Nathan mentioned, because that invests these groups into the political process. And I do think that in many ways, the Morsi government and the incompetence and the deteriorated economic situation and the continued use of violence and the deterioration of the security situation in some ways represents a kind of wonderful opportunity for the opposition to say, this is what the Morsi government has produced. This is what the Muslim Brotherhood's domination of the Shura Council has produced. Give us a chance. Now, unfortunately, the shortcomings of the secular liberal groups are also quite significant. They have failed to articulate an easily digestible kind of, talking points that reach large segments of society. They have made limited or very little efforts to go beyond Cairo and Alexandria in terms of activities, outreach, mobilization from below, and so on. And this, of course, is the potential weakness of the opposition. The last thing with regard to, again, why I see the sky not necessarily falling. The first is economic, and it is the case that, and this is true, that in some ways Egypt has always managed to muddle through. And even before Saddam Hussein saved Egypt in 1990 with the invasion of Kuwait, which led to tremendous debt reduction and all kinds of aid to Egypt and so on, which was on the verge of economic crisis in the late 1980s. Egypt has managed to, because of its importance, because of what economic crisis would do to the region, has always managed to find generous benefactors in the region and outside the region, and it is going to continue to do so, as we saw most recently with the influx of $3 billion from Qatar, $2 billion from Libya, $1 billion from Turkey. And the talk in this town by individuals in the international financial institutions that the amount of money that is required to get Egypt going again, not to become a Singapore or a South Korea, but just to survive, is peanuts compared to the money that has been spent with regards to Cyprus or other economic crises. So Egypt will muddle through. It's not going to be an economic takeoff and so on. There's not going to be military intervention that subverts Morsi's presidency. Mr. Morsi will continue for another 3 years, whether we like it or not. And I anticipate and I hope that the liberal secular groups get their act in gear and take advantage of the situation and so on, and manage to make some gains in the upcoming elections, and that the political map in Egypt in the future is not one that is dominated by a hegemonic political party, and it won't be for another reason, because this is not simply a political system that is made up of the Muslim Brotherhood and liberal secular opposition groups. None of us have talked about the Salafi parties. When the Muslim Brotherhood looks at elections, they're not so much afraid of Mr. al-Baradei or the Free Egyptians, they're afraid of the Salafis. And that in itself creates a kind of pluralism, maybe not the pluralism that many of us aspire to, but that itself, I think, ensures that we're not going to see in the future, and I agree with Michael, that politics has forever changed in Egypt. We're not going to see a situation where we have a single dominant political party winning elections without any effort and so on for the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody who spoke today, and open the floor for a question. Please keep it to a question and identify yourself and your affiliation, and wait for the mic to reach you, please. Right here. And if you want to address your question to a specific speaker, you just say that.
Thanks very much. John Anderson, former Foreign Service independent analyst. Coming back to the question of the opposition and whether it has any political reality or ability, comments by Mr. Shahata and Hanna have been suggestive. Given that there appear to be various currents within that National Salvation Front, and both on an ideological plane and a perhaps practical political plane, what are the chances that the opposition in that guise, NSF or others, will actually be able to come to, let's say, political deals for the contest of the parliamentary elections, perhaps identifying districts where they can agree on single candidates. Comments indicate that there's not a lot of hope for a unified opposition. Nonetheless, I'd like to ask, well, Mr. Shahata, Mr. Hanna, others, if they see any continuing political future for the opposition. Thanks.
Okay. We'll take another question and answer them combined. So, Ambassador, here in the back.
Marcel Wahba, former State Department independent consultant. Thank you all for a terrific panel. I really am impressed. It's just been a very interesting morning. And the one point that I didn't hear much discussed, and I think I would probably address it to Dr. al-Anani, is can you give us some comments about the role, not the role, sorry, the relationship between the Ikhwan and the Al-Azhar, and specifically Sheikh al-Tayyib's and his position with the MB? Thank you.
Okay. Michael will start.
Sure. I think one issue, the other group that wasn't mentioned apart from the Salafis is the Fulul, the former regime. And I think this is an unresolved issue that, I mean, it's an uncomfortable and an unresolved issue that has a lot to do with the way the opposition functions. In Shafiq's campaign, we saw some of the old patronage networks. They're weak, they're fragile, they still exist. That have been part of the election machinery of the NDP. Some of those networks were reactivated for the Shafiq campaign. They spent money. They have some coherence, and they're somewhat effective. The problem, of course, is that there's this fundamental divide of fragmentation. All of these groups, yes, are opposed to Morsi and the Ikhwan, but until this is resolved in some way, I think that's going to diffuse the effectiveness of the opposition. I think there are multiple ways to think about it from the perspective of the sort of revolutionary opposition, those who took part in Tahrir. You know, in closed doors, you might get a different answer than you do in public, but particularly for the younger revolutionary socialists, say, dealing with the former regime is a red line. The inclusion of Amr Moussa in the National Salvation Front was a big issue for some of them. So perhaps tactical arrangements. Some of the former regime people are running in certain districts while opposition people run in others. I think that level of not perhaps, you know, not outright coordination is very important. If the opposition is to be a full reflection of the opposition in Egyptian society to the Muslim Brotherhood. So, and the only other point I would add is financing. The opposition is broke, and some of this is intentional. The cases that have been brought against the Sawiris family say, if you talk to opposition politicians and you say, what are your big problems? Funding is always at the top of that list, and they'll say, look, nobody is willing to give us money. Major businessmen who are in our camp are afraid to donate. Why? The public prosecutor has been politicized. Clearly, I mean, it has been, criminal justice system has been corrupted under the Muslim Brotherhood. And there is a real fear that if businessmen start giving money to the opposition, that all of a sudden there'll be a 2006 tax case that pops up or something else. This public prosecutor has proven himself a very effective political tool of the MB. So these are two issues that I think will have a big bearing on how well the opposition does in the near future.
Yes, I mean, I'm not completely pessimistic with regard to the possibility of cooperation. I do think there will be some defections, of course, when individuals and political parties feel that and there'll be, disagreements as to the bargain that is made with regard to dividing up districts where people are on a slate of candidates and so on. But I think, I mean, if we were to be very specific, what likely groups are going to maintain some kind of coalition and coordination with regard to the elections, I would think that the Constitution Party, the Popular Current, and the Social Democrats are likely, more likely maybe than others, to put forward a unified list. And I think that they have the opportunity to do better than for the reasons I mentioned before, than the relatively modest 18–17% that the liberal secular opposition did in the first election. So I'm not completely pessimistic with regard to that. And the left will do fairly well as well. I mean, this is the only secular liberal opposition party that actually has a presence in Egypt outside of the major cities, that has organization, that has some financing, actually. And so they are going to probably do as well as they did, if not better, than in the 2011 elections. And they got, I think, 7.5% of the seats in parliament and I think 9% of the popular vote. So
I would also, a quarter of the old parliament isn't nothing. Right? We've also sort of exaggerated. I mean, a quarter of a parliament it was a real block.
Less than a quarter.
Well, all right. I mean, but not far behind the Salafis, who all of a sudden we decided, because of dynamics, were a very important political group. Well, I mean, let's look at both of those groups. They're not that dissimilar in terms of their share of the vote.
And there's maybe one other thing to say about that, which is, I mean, it's quite trite to say, but that politics makes strange bedfellows. And one can imagine a situation, I don't know what the likelihood of this happening, of the Salafis doing relatively well in the next parliamentary elections, because declining support for Mr. Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood often could translate easily into increasing support for the Noor Party and other Salafi parties. And as many of you know, of course, they have been engaged in discussions with and helping to some extent, because they also do not want to see a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated political system, secular liberal groups. One can imagine a situation where they do as well as they did last time, right? And secular liberal forces doing slightly better than they did last time and having 50% plus one of the vote.
Okay, Khalil will talk about the Al-Azhar and Ikhwan, and you may shed light as well of the dynamics inside the Salafi movement in Egypt.
Yeah. That's right. This is surprising. Right, I think there is no clear relationship between Al-Azhar and the Brotherhood. You can talk about mixture of competition at some times and cooperation sometimes. And I can talk about two kind of levels to look at this kind of relationship. The first one is the religious one or theological one. The second one is the political level. The first one is about to what extent there is some kind of convergence between the Brotherhood in terms of religious ideology, in terms of theology, doctrine, and between Al-Azhar. I think both of them, they belong to the same school of thought, which is the Ash'ari school of thought, and they have some kind of Sufi traditions. So on the religious level, there is no such kind of divergence between both of them. On the political level, I think there is, this pattern of the Brotherhood to take over everything in Egypt, including Al-Azhar, create some kind of problems with the Al-Azhar institution. And we have seen this over the last few days, this crisis of the poisoning students that created problems with the Brotherhood. And they started to press Al-Azhar to change the head of the University of Al-Azhar. And also we can find some kind of conflict if you look at this Sukuk law, which the Islamic bonds that can finance the economy. Al-Azhar rejected this law, although it's supposed to be an Islamic law, right? And the interesting thing that the reason behind the rejection is not a religious one; it's merely a political one. And also, we shouldn't overlook the crisis of choosing a new mufti in Egypt. And the Brotherhood nominated a person, a very known leader, Abdurrahman al-Barr, the member of the Guidance Bureau, to run against one of the sheikhs of Al-Azhar. So there is some kind of competition sometimes, and there is some kind of cooperation. About the Salafi, it's a big story, but generally speaking, I would say that there is no monolithic Salafi movement. We have a diverse Salafi movement that ranges from very radical and extreme Salafis, jihadi Salafis, which they don't recognize any kind of democracy. They are anti-democratic values, and they would like to apply Sharia, and they have a very rigid and very conservative political views. On the other hand, you have very politicized Salafi parties and movements like Hizb al-Noor or the Noor Party, Al-Watan Party, and the Raya Party. And between both of them, you can have different types of Salafism. I would say there is growing tendency among Salafis to be more involved in politics. And to some extent, they have some kind of opportunism to try to press the Brotherhood and try to outbid the Brotherhood to gain some power. And this is part of the problem now. On one hand, the Brotherhood is trying to appease and sometimes try to manipulate the Salafi by giving them some kind of ideological concessions in terms of the constitution, such as what happened when they talked about Al-Azhar as the main reference to interpret the Sharia. And sometimes they try to compete with each other. So Salafi is a very diverse movement that has different views when it comes to how to play politics. So I don't know if I could give a brief idea about them or not.
Mr. Mohammed here, first row.
Mohammed Finnaw, Voice of America. If the Muslim Brotherhood is not adapting and the opposition is not compromising, how would the crisis in Egypt get solved, and how would the upcoming election results contribute or hinder such a solution?
Okay. Another question from lady next, please.
Hi, my name is Zakia Kafafi, former division director of the National Science Foundation. I have a couple of comments, actually. As we all know, the uprising in Egypt was the product of very well-educated, enlightened people, and this that evolved into a revolution was hijacked by the Muslim Brothers. So I think there are a couple of near-term plans and long-term plans that, in my opinion, could be adopted for a true reform in Egypt. The near-term plans to me, was very obvious during the pre-election times. I was there last May, where the opposition should wake up and unite. There are good elements in every sector, including the Mubarak regime, including the present regime. There are good elements in all of these. And if the opposition had the opposition united during pre-election, we would not have had Morsi as the president of Egypt. So this is kind of, looking into the future. The long-term plan is education, education, education. Unless Egyptians are educated and enlightened, and I'm talking about most of the Egyptians some of them don't even know how to read and write, there won't be true progress in Egypt.
Thank you. May Nathan will answer the first question about the deadlock between the Brotherhood and the opposition.
Well, in a sense, I've sort of given my views on this already. I mean, it's what I think is if there is going to be any kind of return to normal politics in Egypt, it has to be centered. I think the centerpiece of that has to be the electoral process. And to me, the real question then is, to what extent does the opposition participate, and to what extent do you have a parliament that represents multiple views? I would go back to something that Mike said about Tunisia. The funny thing is, if you go to Tunisia and you tell them, hey, your transition is going so much better than Egypt, the Tunisians get angry. No, we're just as screwed up as the Egyptians, they say. And in some sense, they're right. I mean, the same kind of polarization takes place. But what you do have in Tunisia is a political outcome in which there has to be some kind of discussion among political actors before there's any path forward. The Egyptian constitutional framework, if it's accepted as inevitable, even if not fully legitimate by the opposition, is one that I think has an incredible amount of ambiguity. You've got Mohamed Morsi, a Freedom and Justice Party president, who will complete his term. If you had a split parliament, there's no telling, I think, how this would work out mechanically. You really just have to, in a system like this, I think you almost have to work it out in practice. But one in which you had a very robust opposition, in which you had no automatic majority. We've already heard how Salafis are as much rivals to the Brotherhood and so on. Then you would have a political process in which, in order to get legislation out, you would really have to coordinate at least across parts of the political spectrum. And there's important legislation to be written that will determine an awful lot of the course of Egypt's political development. I go back to the question about al-Azhar. I mean, there's an al-Azhar law that was decreed by the SCAF, the contents of which could be changed by the incoming parliament, which would make al-Azhar a very, very different place. So those are the kinds of things that are up for grabs. I will pull in just kind of the last comment. To me, the most important thing is not that the opposition unify in an electoral sense, right? Because if you have a system in which the majority of the seats are decided according to proportional representation, that may be less important. That might be important coordinating in the individual seats. What is much more important is that they decide to essentially play electoral politics, and that means building electoral machineries. That means building organizations outside of Cairo. That means hooking up with constituencies, whether they're leading families, labor organizations, whatever, outside of Cairo. That's probably much more important than any kind of formal unity. My own sense is that if we're going to elections, or I shouldn't say we, if they are going to elections, if Egyptians are going to elections, then it's probably time for opposition leaders to stop talking to each other and to start talking to other Egyptians.
Michael would like to comment on that.
One point, I agree, but if we lack that self-correcting base, then that's an important and possible outcome to consider. And so a lot of the rights community says, we supported Morsi. It's not about opposition or not. It's about repression, right? It's about rights, and those exist separate and apart from any discussion of electoral outcomes. So I think that's right. That's ideal. But if we're faced with a suboptimal outcome, we have to still be able to, whether it be Egyptians, rights organizations, civil society, or the international community, talk very clearly about repressive actions, right? I mean, these are, again, for me, these are two different things.
And Khalil will add something here.
To respond to the first part of the question about the adaptation of the Brotherhood and to what extent they can adopt some kind of democratic values. I would say there are three ways that you can affect the Brotherhood. The first one is the pressure. And this pressure should come whether from within or outside. Until now, we cannot talk about a real reformist wing within the Brotherhood that is pushing for more transparent and democratic kind of movement. I think, as I said, the majority of those who used to adopt this kind of reformist and democratic values, they now marginalized or excluded now. So it's very difficult to expect that they will change from within. The second type is to press them from outside, and this comes already from the street. However, it has some kind of counterproductive outcome that the conservatives within the movement is trying to use this kind of pressure to unify the movement behind the leadership. The last point is about creating some kind of viable alternatives. And I think this is what Nathan talked about, that to have strong opposition that can push them to give concessions. So these are the three main ways that you can affect the Brotherhood and can push them to adapt to the new reality in Egypt right now.
Okay, somebody from this side, the gentleman here, in the back.
Robert Mertz. I'm curious what the motivations are for the military in the context of what's been described by the four panelists, and what might tip them one way or the other vis-a-vis the Ikhwan.
Sure. Other gentleman here.
My name is Dick Rosen. I'm with the Council for a Community of Democracies. My question is more about the electorate than about the elections. The point made by one of the previous questioners about education is very sound, but I think it needs emphasis on democracy education. Because if you don't have that citizenship understanding and appreciation on the part of the electorate, the elections don't mean very much. And I hark back to what one of the other speakers said earlier about the transitions in Spain and Portugal and other places. There was an electorate that could back up the Constitution, back up the election, back up the revolution. It seems to me in the case of the present day in the Middle East, it's more like Europe was in 1848 when there were revolutionary movements, but they didn't go anywhere because all they had to appeal to was the Congress of Vienna, great powers, but not an electorate that could back up the revolution and make it real.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to comment on the army role in all what happened? Michael will start.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah, I mean, you know, the military. Morsi's reshuffling of the military leadership was a pacted process, right? So it's important to understand that you know, it wasn't Morsi coming in and ousting the generals and putting his stamp of authority over civilian control. That's not what happened. It was an exhaustion on the part of the military with the burdens of governance and understanding for many of them that their credibility, which is still, I think, the highest among any institution in Egyptian society, had been damaged by their stewardship during the first 18 months of the transition. They wanted out, and they got a great deal. The Constitution has I wouldn't even say preserved military autonomy, but expanded it. They are untouchable by civilians. So they are not at a moment where they want to get back into politics. They didn't like it. They were subject to criticism and scrutiny. All the old red lines in discourse, popular discourse about military economic stakes and holdings were erased. People talk about those things now. That's not a comfortable position for them to be in. I will say, however, that this is an uneasy relationship. This isn't a military leadership that has close ties with the Brotherhood. Far from it. These have grown up traditionally as antagonistic institutions. And obviously, they might be misguided in how they have approached issues of governance, but they're patriotic. They worry, in a sense, not just about venal economic interests, but they're patriots in the sense that they worry about national stability. At some point, the sort of national stability concerns and the economic concerns merge because rising instability will endanger your economic stake. We're far from that now, but clearly the military has given warning signals. They've given very pointed statements about the political process itself, worries about the dysfunction, and a comment by one of the high military command that this could lead to the collapse of the state. So, you know, based on their very recent past and where Egypt is now, you know, you have to take these comments seriously. So I would say they don't want to in any way get back in. There are ways of intervening far short of a coup. They could, if faced with the prospect of deploying in the future, deploy with conditions based on consensual political outcomes. They might have that ability to leverage their role into pushing political outcomes that's separate and apart from ousting Morsi, because I think we are a long way off from that. But I think obviously if you look at Morsi's approach to the fact-finding commission that was leaked, that implicated the SCAF in human rights abuses during the transition, you get a sense of where power dynamics lay. This isn't an issue that the presidency can push forward. They're not going to take on the military. So we're a long way off, but the military is part of the discussion. And the interesting thing is many of the opposition that very recently in the past saw the military as their sort of primary foe have now all of a sudden, you know, made nice with the military in some respects and now see the Muslim Brotherhood as a much greater long-term threat.
Okay. Samir would like to add something for the military role?
No, I tend to see them with a little more skepticism, I think. But I think certainly, you know, maintaining the economic benefits that they and their industrial complex hold autonomy from civilian decision-making and immunity from prosecution, certainly are all the things that they received. I think the interesting thing is that, and this is really quite startling, is that if we look at the popularity of the military at the time of, say, the presidential elections and so on, and we look at the discourse about the military now, I mean, their stock price has gone up incredibly. I mean, they were, despised by large segments of the people who made the revolution, and certainly. And as Michael mentioned, now, unfortunately, some people are asking them, have forgotten, of course, and the SCAF's mismanagement and malice, and are asking the military to play either a larger role in politics, to put pressure on the Brotherhood, or in some cases, actually to take over. So.
Okay, second row here.
Hi, Diana Turacek, Middle East Broadcasting Network. The internal political situation in Egypt is highly politicized, obviously, both within Egypt and outside of Egypt. No matter who you talk to, you're going to get a different narrative. If you follow the media, you're going to get, whether in Egypt or in the United States, you're going to get a different narrative. My question is, how certain are you about your judgments? About the current situation in Egypt, and what are the key unknowns that could significantly change the analysis that you've presented here today?
Okay, and gentleman here.
Hi, Mohammed Darwaza, MENA analyst for Medley Global Advisors. My question really comes back to economics. There seems to be the thinking that Egypt can muddle through based on Gulf money or money from Libya, but even if they don't, it's really too big to fail anyway. And it seems the consequence of that argument is that all these reforms that need to be taken are going to get pushed down the road, potentially even to next year. And the big losers here are the Egyptian people. My question is, can this sort of social pressures boil up to a point, even this summer, that we'll see people coming down to the street and we kind of see scenes that we saw in 2011?
Okay, Samuel will start.
I mean, just one thing that I didn't mention that relates directly to your question is that in some ways there are some elements of the secular liberal opposition who are hoping for precisely this. So some are banking on the military to intervene and save them from the Muslim Brotherhood, and others are banking on Egypt to, excuse the metaphor, go over an economic cliff, which will then necessitate, as a result of massive social unrest, military intervention, and then the end of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think the point that you make is a good one, and certainly there are serious economic difficulties, and these things are all interrelated. I mean, if there is not some kind of political consensus, or at least a working movement towards something, if there is not increased security, addressing the security concerns, and if there aren't real reforms, then things aren't going to look very good for Egypt. But at the same time, I think it is, regardless of how we feel about the Muslim Brotherhood, just politically rational for Morsi and the government not to want to implement difficult economic measures before an election. That would apply to any government in France or the United States. Are they likely to implement those difficult economic belt tightening measures after the election? Probably, because if you look at the economic philosophy of the Freedom and Justice Party as outlined in their 2011 platform, it is very amenable to private capital, to making a business-friendly environment, to encouraging domestic capital, and so on. So they need to get through to the elections in order then to implement some of the reforms that you are assuming are necessary to take Egypt in the right direction. It is important, however, to say that the question of the IMF loan and this economic roadmap is a highly contentious one in Egypt. And many elements of the opposition are opposed to the idea of an IMF loan and the reduction of subsidies, the increasing of taxes, the shrinking of the state's role with regard to social services, and so on. So this itself is a very kind of contentious issue, and there is not a consensus about what kind of economic policies need to be implemented for Egypt to actually have sustainable human development.
Okay. Michael?
Yeah, I think it's very important to not disaggregate economic policy and the politics, right? They are one thing, right? They're not, you cannot implement massive systemic reform on the economic side without some measure of broad-based political consensus. Now, for the opposition then, they naturally would want the Muslim Brotherhood government to be exposed to the consequences of their decisions, because in that is the possibility of leverage, of saying, look, let's talk. It's not just about the IMF. It's not just about politics. It's about the economic crisis. It's about something much broader. We have a whole raft of things, and if you want us to take a bullet for you on the IMF, which is decidedly unpopular on a social level, there's got to be something in it for us, right? We're not going to be your sort of shield, and then you will be re-marginalized. So, in a sense, the prospect you talked about, which was Egypt continually being bailed out. It's for the MB, it is about short-term ad hoc consolidation before the elections, and at which point they won't have suffered the consequences of their mismanagement. So I think it's dangerous then to encourage that, because then I can assure you that any of those issues on the political side are going to be ignored totally. So I think. With security sector reform, with the economics, all these things require something much broader and bigger than the Muslim Brotherhood. Any of these things, the political, economic, and social crises facing the country, require something that the Muslim Brotherhood has just not been willing to give in their short time in power.
Okay. Nathan?
I want to try to tackle the first question, which everybody seems to be dodging, because I think it's a fantastic question. What don't we know, and how confident are we, because we can't know anything? Maybe it's too philosophical a question for a very practical panel like this, but I think and I'll tell you why it's a great question for Egypt today, precisely for the reason that you suggested. I've never seen a political environment where, in a sense, one's ideological position or political position determines the facts, okay? There's like no set of common knowledge that everybody shares. And so Khalil, for instance, mentioned something that sounds like an absolutely routine event, food poisoning in a dormitory, and all of a sudden it's this group trying to get that group, and it's really a plot against the head of the university because they want to get, the Brotherhood wants to get him out, or this sort of thing. And these kind of rumors, there's an attack, a looting of the Semiramis Hotel, well, this really is Khairat Shatu who's really trying to drive down the price so he can buy it, and this sort of thing. And this is the staple of Egyptian political life. I often said that this is one of the rare times it's easier to follow Egyptian politics the farther away from the country you get, because you can kind of tune out some of this stuff. But it does create a real problem for an analyst. If I were to answer your question quite literally, how confident am I of what I've said? I said I'm fairly confident, because essentially my analysis is based on what happens in an environment in which you have political mistrust so deeply ingrained. But what I would do is turn around your question a little bit and say that I can sort of go to what Khalil said, put this in a little bit of comparative perspective. We are in a transition period. We're in a transition period where Egypt does not have a fully functioning democracy, but it still has one key feature of democratic politics, and that is that outcomes are uncertain, right? That's, in a sense, a definition of democracy. You don't know. If you know who's going to win all future elections, it's not a democracy. And so you have a political system in which uncertainty is the name of the game. Where I think we may get more certainty is precisely in the region, in the area where some panelists have already talked about, electoral outcomes. We've had a series of elections, a referendum on constitutional amendments, We've had a series of parliamentary elections, upper house elections, presidential elections. Each time, the issues were different, the electoral rules were different, the political configuration was extremely different each time, even what people were voting on. And so we don't really have a good basis on which to predict, I think, future electoral behavior. We may be going to an era in which all of a sudden electoral analysis becomes a little bit easier to do. It's extremely difficult to do right now. And so it may be, and what that will do is allow political actors to make calculations based on its expected effect on electoral outcomes. Everybody's operating in the dark right now. Opposition. The Brotherhood, I think, is a little bit better because they have some idea of who their core constituency is, and they're good at counting, okay? So that they have some rough sense of this. Most of the others don't. And so a political environment in which people can make more certain, at least electoral calculations, will be one that I think might calm down a little. That may be a process of several years.
But one other point is that diminishing popular participation, which of course then makes a group like the MB that's able to mobilize and can count on its 20 to 25% hardcore constituency to always come out, it gives them even more certainty. And you mentioned the question about the electorate. I mean, the most noticeable feature of the electorate is that electoral participation continues to go down, and I assume that will be the case in the next election. In terms of an unknown, I think it's, to get back to your question, Mohammed, it's the economic crisis and the sort of limits of social resiliency. I'm not as sanguine as Sam about the ability of Egypt to always muddle through. I think that's a dangerous assumption. I think it's the most likely outcome. But how big is the informal economy? Are traditional ways of coping sufficient? Is Qatar always going to be there to throw a few $1 billion into the central bank? And at some point, if there's a currency crisis, we're going to be beyond those points. So, and this is an environment where we have seen political violence. The sort of rules of the game have changed. Mass mobilization is something that we have seen over and over again. There's a lot of weapons from Libya. Sectarian violence is on the increase. I mean, there are all sorts of stressors that, on the security side, on the political side, that impact the economics as well. So, I don't assume that we are going to get a worst case outcome. But the longer this goes on in sort of muddling indeterminate fashion, I don't assume that that's a predictor for the future. I assume that perhaps we might get to that breaking point, and I don't think we should assume muddle through as our baseline.
And before we take the last two questions, I remind you there is another fantastic panel following this one. In 15 minutes we'll start. And before we have the last two questions in the middle here, I will have my small question to Khalil. Egypt, known to be a very centralized country, Cairo played the historical role in governing Egypt. But the three top leaders of the Brotherhood, the president, the supreme guide, and his deputy, Morsi, Shatir, and Badia, came from outside Cairo, Sharqiyya, Gharbiyya, and Bani Suef. What do we make of it? And you answer me after we get these two questions. The middle here.
Raouf Abed. Michael touched briefly on the relationship between the United States and the Muslim Brotherhood. One party that was not mentioned by any of the panels is the role of Jerusalem or Israel. And, many members of Congress here, senators and House members, it's not a secret, have been telling the Brotherhood members directly that their biggest ally is the Jewish lobby in the States. And this has come to in full display when Rand Paul introduced the bill, to stop the F-16 from going to, to Egypt. And obviously he was not well informed, not that I agree with him on anything, but anyhow, it was soundly defeated with 78 senators going, for it. And also Jerusalem being very quiet after all the Morsi, statements on, pigs and, all kinds of things anti-Jewish. Now, this love relationship of strange fellows, as one member mentioned, between the Brotherhood and Jerusalem, is it only due because they are able to control Hamas and that's the only reason, is it? Or does anybody on the panel see something more to it?
And second and last question here.
Joe Brand, Patton Boggs. I have a question for Nathan Brown. After the next election, there would be a prime minister. Is it likely to be Hayat al-Shader? That's question one. And second question is, what will be the power sharing between the president and the new prime minister?
Okay, we'll start with Michael.
On the issue of Israel, look, the military the security sector is in charge of sensitive foreign policy files. In the form of the military, the National Security Council, and the intelligence. They are ascendant. This isn't a place where the Muslim Brotherhood and the presidency can make unilateral decisions. The Muslim Brotherhood is one thing in this instance, and the military is another. And particularly with rising uncertainty in regard to politics and the creation of popular pressure as a variable in national behavior, it's not surprising that the Israelis now look to the military as the sort of one pillar of stability, the people they know and cooperate with. So have we seen the Israelis become more comfortable with the Egyptian military despite concerns about Sinai and other issues? Yes. Does that mean the Israelis are comfortable with the Muslim Brotherhood? No, they're not. That's a tough one to imagine. Do they imagine that this is the worst case scenario? No, but some of that also, I think, is driven by a misunderstanding of Camp David that exists in Israel and the United States, that sees it as a coercive bargain that is the function of military aid, and it's not that. It endures because it's in Egypt's national security interest to endure. It's the sort of litmus test for its credibility, and it's not a country that can sort of engage in adventurism on that front. So, I think Israel looks to the military now as a pillar of stability, and that's the fundamental, the most consistent aspect of the Egypt-Israel bilateral relationship.
Nathan?
Great questions, which I don't know the answer to. But I can talk intelligently about them very briefly. Right now, what you have is a cabinet that is headed by Hisham Andel, who is this figure that the Brotherhood regards, and they regard the cabinet as a group, as a technocratic cabinet. Not other Egyptians outside the Brotherhood will look at Hisham and this is a guy you brought him out of nowhere, nobody'd heard of him before. He's got a beard. He's Brotherhood. That's not how the Brotherhood looks at him, and that's not how they look at this current cabinet. And there's no secret of what their inclination is, because they've been frank about it. They would prefer a party-based cabinet. They don't think that they have the political basis now to do so. And after the elections, what they would like would be something that would look like a clear majority, a cabinet that has clear majority support in the parliament that is able then to push through legislation. Will they get it? That depends an awful lot on the election results and what kind of coalition that they would like to form. But I think the inclination is to go to a partisan cabinet, figuring that this will solve and answer an awful lot of the problems and end the holding pattern which Egyptian politics has been since February of 2011. Particular individuals, I don't know. And this is where the uncertainty becomes extremely extremely severe, is because the way in which people speculate about who's trying to do what and what people's real intentions are is absolutely out of control. I have absolutely no idea if Khairat al-Shatu wants to be prime minister, and I have no idea if Mohammed Morsi wants him to be prime minister, and so on. But the Brotherhood has been clear that is what they would see. How that would actually work, I don't think we really know. And again, here I'm going to give you a frustratingly ambiguous answer. The way the Constitution is written could be pushed in many different kinds of directions, and the particular partisan configuration of that cabinet could push it in many different directions. I think the presidency has some tools, if it really wanted to run the country, continue to run the country from the presidency, that it could probably do so. Would it do so if it had a cabinet that it was comfortable with? And it doesn't have a cabinet that is really all that comfortable with right now, I think. I'm not sure. So a lot of this will be worked out in practice, but an awful lot will depend on the particular configuration that comes out of this parliament.
Okay, Samer?
Just on a technical note, 2 points to be made. Even if Khairat al-Shatu wanted to be prime minister, I think, and I don't know what the others would feel, that it would be an incredible miscalculation to place him as prime minister, because, you know, Khairat al-Shatir is as despised by many opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood as much as Morsi is. So it would really not be a shrewd move. It would be something that would galvanize opposition to them. And then the second thing, and this, you know, gets to, well, this could be the miscalculation that we're talking about, or an example of
The
it.
Brotherhood never miscalculates.
Never miscalculates. And I think, you know, what we've hit on, your question, what it's hit on, is a way to remove Mr. Morsi from the presidency. Because if I'm not mistaken, the Constitution stipulates that if the prime minister is not approved, appointed by the president, but then not approved by, I don't know what the percentage is of the parliament, and if the president insists on the prime minister, that is the one case in which,
Go back and look.
yeah, that the president can be removed.
Well, they're general impeachment grounds. I mean, they're generalized impeachment grounds.
Right.
But,
You know,
you know,
other than that,
yeah.
kind of a political sense. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a small point, and it's not going to happen, but, yeah.
And final word to Khalil.
Final question, all right. I think the question is very important about the social character of the Brotherhood. And as I said in my presentation, it's a very broad social movement that belongs mainly to the low and middle, or lower middle classes in Egypt. And it's a cross-cutting movement that encompasses different people. But the question is how people get promoted within the movement is a very important one, because it's based mainly on a certain kind of values that anyone would like to move up within the organization has to follow, particularly the obedience issue, the commitment, the reality, the devoutness of the member. And this is a very clear issue with President Morsi himself. He moved very quickly from a very normal person within the movement to become the head of the political section within, I would say, 3 or 4 years. And then he became the head of the FGP, and now he is, of course, the president of Egypt. So you mentioned that Badi', Khairat al-Shatir, and Morsi coming from outside Cairo. I would say that 90% at least of the guidance bureau coming from outside. And this is what one of our colleagues, he passed away, unfortunately, Hussam Tamam, he called this ruralization of the Brotherhood, that those people come from rural areas, they took over the movement over the last, I would say, 10 years. And this is something of, you know, social transformation within the movement itself. So I think this is a very natural, and that's why we have this kind of traditional mindset, conservative mindset that belongs to this kind of social class. So.
Okay, thank you very much, and it can't be any better. I never get rich listening to Egyptian specialists like today, and being Egyptian myself, I'm just expressing it. Thank you very much, and wait for the next great panel in 10 minutes. Thank you.